What is up, guys? It's your boy Steady Chaos coming to you with a comparison video tonight. So ever since I uploaded my video on the LG C10 review about a week and a half ago, I've noticed in the comment string I've been getting a lot of questions from people about whether or not they should buy the C9 or they should buy the C10. A lot of people say, I want the latest and greatest thing. The C10 is the 2020 model. I should get the C10, right? But the problem is I found the C9 for $400 or $500 cheaper. What should I do? And generally, my advice to those people has been to get the C9. If you can find it for $300, $400, $500 cheaper, get the C9 over the C10 because the C9 and the C10 basically have the same picture quality for the most part, with a few caveats. But I don't want you to take my word for it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up rtings.com, which is my favorite website for TV reviews. And they recently released the LG C10 review. And they used the test bench 1.5, and that basically means all the various tests that they ran in 2019 for the C9 for HDR, SDR content, contrast, local dimming, input lag, all those various benchmarks for a television that you as a consumer are really interested in. They also ran for the C10. So we can take those tests and we can compare the actual numbers and test results side by side for the C9 and C10. And based on those numbers, perhaps we can come to a clearer determination as to whether you should buy the C9 or the C10. So let's dive right in, guys. Let's do it. Alright, so on the left side of your screen is the LG C9 review scores, and on the right side of your screen is the LG C10 review scores. So first I want to start out with style. So if you look over here on the left side of your screen, you'll see that the LG C9 right here has a 9.5 out of 10 style score, and on the right side of your screen, the LG CX also has a 9.5 out of 10 style score. Basically, there is no difference in the style of these two TVs. They are both very sleek, very sexy, and use the same exact stand. So moving on from style, you can see the backside of these TVs are exactly the same. And from the side, the TVs look exactly the same. Build quality for both is a 9 out of 10. So moving on to the nitty-gritty of picture quality and picture performance, what you want after all, right? So you see on the left-hand side of the screen here, the LG C9 has a 10 out of 10 for contrast and a 10 out of 10 for local dimming, and the LG C10 also has a 10 out of 10 for both categories. This is not surprising. Both televisions are OLED panels. Both televisions are self-emissive, so that's why dimming is essentially perfect. That's why it scores a 10 out of 10 on both panels. Because if you need a screen to be black, then it will be entirely black because all of the pixels can shut themselves off. Whereas with an LED LCD screen, it requires a backlight, and often there's a local dimming system where certain areas of the backlight are dimming and lighting up, and that can lead to light bleed, that can lead to haloing and other visual problems. You don't have any of that with the C9 or the C10. So rest assured, when it comes to contrast and local dimming, you're looking at perfect performance for both. No difference. Moving down to SDR and HDR performance, however, we do see a difference here. So I'm not going to run through every single number to save time, but looking over at the LG C9, you see it scores a 7.1 out of 10 on SDR, and it manages 335 nits of brightness with SDR real scene. So basically what that means is the maximum luminosity the TV can obtain while playing a movie or watching a TV show in real world viewing terms. We're not talking about a 2% or a 10% window here. We're just looking at real world SDR performance, and it was measured at 335 nits, which for SDR content is fine. It's solid, it's decent, it's okay. Now you look over at the C10 and it scores a 7 out of 10, slightly lower. So the SDR real scene brightness for the C10 is 321 nits. So that is 14 nits lower than the C9, but that, for all intents and purposes, is a negligible difference. I don't think anyone would be able to notice that. Even if the TVs were side by side, it probably wouldn't be noticeable. But when you move over to HDR measurements, if you look at the C9, a 7.3 out of 10, and the C10 slightly lower at 7.1 out of 10. Now the C9 has, for HDR real scene peak brightness, 726 nits of brightness, and then on the C10 we're looking at 685 nits of peak brightness. So you're talking 41 nits of difference between the two there. in terms of peak brightness in real scene viewing. Now, if you again were to line these TVs up side by side, I don't think that a 41 nit difference between the two in terms of real scene viewing with HDR would be noticeable, but it is again worth noting that the C9 is slightly brighter than the C10. Now, we can't be certain if this is due to panel variance. After all, every panel that comes off the manufacturing line is not exactly the same when it comes to luminosity and color reproduction. There can be some variance based on various manufacturing processes. So the question remains then, is this difference in luminosity just a difference in panel variance? Meaning that when Artings got their C9, that it was a particularly bright panel compared to the rest of the pack, and when Artings got their C10, it was a dimmer panel compared to the rest of the pack. Well, we may never know. All we know for certain is that Artings did score the C9 a 7.3 and the C10 a 7.1, leading me to believe that Artings believes that in general the C9 was brighter or had more luminosity than the C10. But again, keep in mind, it's not a massive difference. 726 nits, 685 nits. It's in the same ballpark, and you probably wouldn't notice a difference. So moving on down to gray uniformity and viewing angle. So with gray uniformity on the C9, you have an 8.6 out of 10. And with viewing angle, an 8.8 out of 10. Moving over to the C10, you have a gray uniformity of 8.4 out of 10 and a viewing angle of 8.4 out of 10. So both categories are ranked or scored lower than the C9. Now, if we look at standard deviation in gray uniformity, Arting says that a good value is less than 2.5% standard deviation. So you have the C9 coming in at 0.989, which is a very good score, and then you have the C10 coming in at 1.526. Both of these values are good and probably wouldn't be noticeable. Noticeable difference is about 1%. So the difference is not 1%, the difference is about 0.6%. So you wouldn't really notice a difference, but again, it's worth noting that the C9 again is slightly cleaner and ranks slightly better than the C10. And then when you look at viewing angle, this surprised me because all OLED panels basically have great viewing angles when it comes to color washout, color shift, brightness loss, all that kind of stuff, gamma shift. So looking at the C9, again, 8.8 out of 10, and then washout starts at 49 degrees, and with the C10 and 8.4 out of 10, washout starts at 48 degrees. So you're saying to yourself, that's pretty much the same, right? I don't see any difference there, Josh. Well, when you move down to brightness loss, you have to be at a 67 degree angle in order for brightness loss to really begin. On the C10, and that's on the C9. On the C10, you only have to be at 62 degrees for brightness loss to begin. And then when you're talking gamma shift at 67 degrees on the C9, and then over on the C10, gamma shift begins at 57 degrees. And according to Artings, a difference in 10 degrees can make a noticeable difference in screen viewing angles. So you have a 10 degree difference here between the C9 and the C10. So it is worth noting that you may experience some more unwanted gamma shifting on the C10 as opposed to the C9, depending on your viewing arrangement in your living room or whatever your man cave setup. But overall, again, keep in mind, both TVs score quite well with the C9 at an 8.8 and the C10 at an 8.4. These aren't massive differences in every category because after all, color washout, color shift, and black level rays are pretty much uniform across the board for the C9 and the C10. It's only brightness loss and gamma shift performance that is slightly worse on the C10. But once again, the C9 scoring a little bit better here. So moving on to black uniformity, not surprising, OLED panels, self-emissive technology. Both TVs score a 10 out of 10. Although once again, if you look at the standard deviation here, a good score is anything below 1%. You have the C9 coming in at 0.249%, which is a great score, very low. That's why it gets basically a perfect score. But you look over at the C10, it's a 0.416, almost double the score. Almost, not quite, double the score of the C9. So while black uniformity is rated at 10 out of 10 on both, there is slightly more deviation on the C10 than there was on the C9. Reflection handling, pretty much identical across the board. Both TVs score a 9.3 out of 10. Excellent reflection handling for both. Now moving down to pre and post calibration. So this is finally where the C10 scores its first win in this category. So when you're looking at pre-calibration on the C9 over here, you're seeing that it's 7.6 out of 10 and 8.3 out of 10 on the C10. So the C10 scores quite a bit better here, and if you're looking at white balance DE, it's basically what it means is average inaccuracy of shades of gray, overall color temperature of all video. So anything under 3 is considered a good value, and you see that the LG C9 is at 3.46, so it's just over that. So that's why it scored a 7.6 out of 10, which is a good score, but not a great score. Moving over to the C10. You see that it scores below that 3 threshold at 2.33. So you're looking at slightly more accurate shades of gray on the C10. But again, this is not a major difference. A noticeable difference is a score of about 1 point. So 3.46, 2.33, yeah, maybe it is a slightly noticeable difference. So rest assured, you C10 owners, when you take your C10 out of the box and you set it up and you put filmmaker mode on or you put cinema mode on, it's probably going to be slightly more accurate than the C9 was. But then when you look at post calibration, that's when you see that there's really no difference between the two TVs once they've been calibrated. So for the C9, a 9.5 out of 10, and for the C10, a 9.6 out of 10. So again, while there is slight variation between the two panels here, the important thing to take away is once your TV is calibrated, whether you own a C9 or a C10, they perform essentially identically. Moving on to upscaling, you have uniform scores across the board here for the C9 and the C10. You have the C9 an 8 for 480p and 720p content, and a 9 out of 10 for 1080p content, and a 10 out of 10 for 4K input and output. So the C10 scores exactly the same across the board. So despite the fact that the C10 has the Alpha 9 Gen 3 processor, it does not seem to lead or translate to improved upscaling across the board. For the most part, and what Artings is saying here is that upscaling performance of SD content and 720p content and FHD 1080p content is basically the same. Moving to 8K input, neither TV has that. Moving down to color gamut. Once again, staying with the same theme that although one panel might slightly outperform the other, for the most part the differences are negligible. You see here both panels on the C9, 8.6 out of 10 on color gamut, and the C10, also an 8.6 out of 10. There's really no difference between the two. For DCI-P, you have 97 and 98% coverage. For Rec 2020, you have 71 and 75% coverage on the C9. Moving over to the C10, same story, same song and dance, 97 and 98% DCI-P3, and 71 and 75% Rec 2020. So if you look at color volume though, this is where you see a bit of a change. So 7.3 out of 10 on the C9 and only a 7.1 out of 10 on the C10. So what's going on here? So if you look at normalized DCI-P3 coverage, ITP. So basically, any value over 80% is good. Both TVs are over that value, and a noticeable difference is about 5%. Well, here the C9 outperforms the C10 by about 4.6%. And the reason why it has slightly more color volume, I'm guessing, is because it's a slightly brighter TV with HDR content, the C9 is. When we think back about the HDR content category we talked about just a few minutes ago, we saw that the C9 had about 40 or 50 extra nits of brightness. And that extra brightness leads to a slightly more coverage of the color spectrum on the 10-bit panel. But if you notice here, if you want to get if you're going to measure against a 10,000 nit TV and DCI-P3 color coverage, then this C9 is only getting 46%. And then pretty much the same for the C10, only 44%. So basically what Artings is calling is how much of the DCI-P3 color space a TV can display at different luminosity levels when compared to an ideal 10,000 nit TV. Whew! Yeah, the OLED TV, as we saw earlier, cannot come anywhere close to 10,000 nits. That's why neither TV scores particularly well in this category, because they top out at around 800 nits, 750, 800 nits. And if you're talking about normalized Rec 2020 coverage, 61% for the C9, 61% also for the C10, and for again, for Rec 2020 coverage compared against an ideal 10,000 nit television, you have about 34% coverage for the C9 and 33.5% coverage for the C10, so not a big difference there. But again, the important thing to take away is that the C9 does score slightly better, once again, in the normalized DCI-P3 color coverage representation, and that's most likely due to the fact that it is a slightly brighter TV, and therefore it can display more shades of various colors. So moving on down to gradient. Now, if you watched my review of the LG CX or C10, one of the negatives I pointed out was that not in all content, and certainly not with a lot of Dolby Vision and 4K HDR10 movies, but with video games in HDR10, I noticed that there was some banding within, for example, Dirt Rally 2, that game on the PlayStation 4 Pro, specifically when looking at the sky from, say, a darker shade of blue to a lighter shade of blue. That transition in between, where you're hoping for a nice smooth color palette, there was some banding and steps of color within that transition, which was kind of disappointing to see on the C10. And you see here the C9 scored a 9 out of 10 on gradient handling, and the C10 lower at 8.6 out of 10. And these are both 10-bit panels. So the important thing to take away once again is that the C9 is slightly brighter on average than the C10. And with that additional brightness for the C9, it's basically allowing the C9 to cover more steps of the 10-bit color spectrum on the panel. So a 10-bit color spectrum means basically 1,024 gradations or 1,024 steps for each color. And ideally, for all of those colors to be displayed accurately, you need 4,000 nits of peak brightness. Well, neither TV has that. But the LG C9 is 40 or 50 nits brighter on average, and because of that, I think it leads to a slightly smoother or better gradient than the C10. Now, if you're looking at, just for example, if we pick a color here, if you're looking at green, standard deviation, or how about blue? Let's take a look at blue. So it's 0.072 deviation for blue on the C9, and a good score is 0.12, so it's well below that. But again, 0.072 on the C9. If you look over at the C10, it's 0.092, so it's a fair bit higher. 0.074 for gray, 0.081 for gray. Red, 0.081, 0.083. Green, 0.091, 0.105 for the C10. So you see, between the two televisions, the C9 on the left and the C10 on the right, there is just a slightly more deviation for all those various colors, red, green, blue, and gray, on the C10 as compared to the C9. Now, this is kind of surprising. When looking at temporary image retention, the C9 scores a 10 out of 10 and the C10 scores a 10 out of 10. Perfect. Now, everyone fears temporary image retention and what it can ultimately lead to, permanent burn-in. But Artings is saying that the C9 shows some slight signs of temporary image retention, but it's too faint to be detected by our software. And on the C10, they say the CX doesn't show any signs of temporary image retention. So they go on to say this test is only indicative of short-term image retention and not the permanent burn-in that may occur with longer exposure of static images. So temporary image retention is not something that Artings is concerned about with either the C9 or the C10, and that is good news. But when you move down to permanent burn-in, that's where you can have the problem. See, both TVs score a 2 out of 10 in this category because both, I don't want to say are prone to burn-in, but burn-in is certainly a possibility, especially if you do not treat your TV well. If you are blaring that contrast and OLED backlight level, if you are running a lot of static images all the time, if you're running Fox News and CNN with their bright red logos in the lower right corner of your screen all the time, and you're leaving the channel on day after day after day, month after month after month, year after year, then eventually you will have burn-in. You will. That's why it is really important to run some of those anti-burn-in features, making sure that you, if you have a problem with pixels or you have a problem with image retention of some sort, you run pixel refresher if you need to, only if you need to. You have pixel shift on, so that the display, when it is off for extended periods of time, it can run some measures to protect against screen degradation and image retention, and that you certainly have logo luminance adjustment at least set to low, so that those HUDs in video games, those static HUDs, or those logos on CNN and Fox News do not burn into your screen. And logo luminance adjustment, basically what it does is it takes a bright red logo like CNN, for instance, and over time it will fade it a little bit. It'll make it a little bit more transparent so that there is less risk of burning. Now moving on to response time as it pertains to gaming for a lot of people. Response time on the C9 a 9.8 out of 10, and on the C10 an almost perfect 9.9 out of 10. So here, there's really no difference between the two. You have 100% response time of 2.4 milliseconds on the C9 and 1.7 milliseconds on the C10. There is no distinguishable difference there, in my opinion. If you're being technical, you can chalk this up as maybe a win for the C10 because it is slightly faster at 1.7 milliseconds. But again, that just could be some sort of panel variance. It's such a minor difference. Both panels are flicker-free as they do not use a backlight. So we can move on to perhaps one of the biggest differences between these two panels, black frame insertion. 8.7 out of 10 on the C9 and a 10 out of 10 on the C10. So the reason why it scores slightly lower on the C9, first of all, is the C9 does not do black frame insertion at 120 Hertz. Only 60 Hertz, whereas the C10, new to this year in 2020, it can do black frame insertion at 120 Hertz, which can be very beneficial for gamers because it gives that appearance of smoother motion. Though, gamers should keep in mind that if you are using black frame insertion for gaming or you're using some sort of motion interpolation, then you will be adding at least some input lag to your gaming experience. With BFI, it wouldn't be a significant amount of input lag. You may not even notice it, but do understand that it can add some input lag to your gaming experience. Another thing to keep in mind about black frame insertion is that when using it on, there's 3 settings on the LG C10. When using it on low, it will dim the screen slightly because what black frame insertion is in between every image that's being displayed by the screen. As you know, a TV kind of works like a flip book. When you have a picture in a book and on every single page there's a successive photo and you flip through the pages, it looks like a movie. It looks like that photo is moving. That's how a TV kind of works. It shows one image after another, after another, after another, which lends the appearance of motion. Well, in between every single slide that the TV is showing, it slips in a black frame. And this black frame, while it helps with motion as we've just talked about, it can also have the effect of dimming the picture. If you go with low black frame insertion, it's a less intense. It says right here, it's a less aggressive form of BFI. So you might not notice quite as much motion smoothness with low BFI, but you also won't lose as much brightness. And if you go on the medium setting, you'll lose a fair bit of brightness, but your motion will improve a little bit. If you go on the high setting, in my experience on the C10, which I do not like, what you could end up seeing is a little bit of flicker because that BFI is so intense. You can see that black frame insertion kind of flickering in and out, and it can be kind of disorienting after a period of time. And also, because the BFI is really aggressive in the high setting, you will dim your screen significantly, even when watching HDR mode. So that's something to keep in mind. But here, it is nice to have the option of the C10 being able to do BFI at 120 Hertz, whereas the C9 cannot do that. So this could be, for some, a major selling point to get the C10. Now moving on down to stutter, both basically score the same. The C9 a 5 out of 10 and the C10 a 4.8 out of 10. Now OLED technology is inherently prone to picture stutter, especially when it comes to low frame content like movies at 24p. Because, as we talked about, the pixel response time on OLED panels is almost instantaneous. It is so fast that when the pixels can populate like that, they can show an image extremely fast. And then by the time the next image is shown, 39.3 milliseconds have passed. You can see right here on the C9. And on the C10, about the same, 39.9 milliseconds have passed. And so, as Artings points out, due to the nearly instantaneous response time, 24p motion can appear to stutter as each frame is held static on screen for nearly the entire time. This can be especially noticeable in slow panning shots when watching movies. So that is something that is inherent to OLED panels because their pixel response time is so fast. LED LCD pixel response times are not nearly as fast on average, therefore leading to less of a stutter problem. But again, you can work with some of the functions, the motion functions within the LG C9 and C10 to try to combat some of this stutter. You know, you can go with a smooth function option to eliminate stutter. You can go with the cinema clear option, or you can go with a natural setting, whatever suits your tastes. There are ways to try to combat stutter in OLED TVs. Now, both TVs score 10 out of 10 as it pertains to Judder. Judder is not the same thing as stutter, though they are easy to confuse. Basically, what Judder is in a nutshell is it's an interruption in the cadence of the frames being displayed by the source and trying to be displayed by the television. So a television may want to display the frames at 60p, and then the movie source might be 24p. So 24p is not divisible into 60, and so that mismatch between 60p and 24p can lead to a jerky motion or a juddery motion with your television. But rest assured, the LG C9 and the LG C10 do have motion functions within their settings menu, kind of like Stutter does, to try to help combat and eliminate this. And according to RTings, both TVs score 10 out of 10 in this category, meaning that you can effectively, with the right settings, remove Judder from your sources. And it says, see our recommended settings to remove Judder here. So if that's something you want to investigate further or are so inclined to try and remove, then by all means go to rtings.com and check out here for the C9 their settings, and for the C10 here their settings. But again, for all intents and purposes, Stutter and Judder for both the C9 and C10 perform exactly the same. Now moving on to variable refresh rate, both TVs are HDMI 2.1 compliant. I know that the C10 has 40 gigabits of bandwidth, but for all intents and purposes, it is HDMI 2.1 compliant. It can do HDMI 4 VRR, both TVs can, and both TVs can do 120 hertz. So they don't specify here for the C9, RTings doesn't, what the VRR range is. They just specify that it can go up to 120 hertz. But on the C10, it gets a 7.9 out of 10 score, and it can do 4K VRR minimum of 40 hertz all the way up to a range of 120 hertz. That is awesome for next-gen gaming, as I assume not all, certainly not all. We know Assassin's Creed is going to be 30 frames per second, but that is also a cross-gen game. I think once we get into a year or two into the life cycles of the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, we'll be seeing that more often than not, games will be running at 60 frames per second, and that would put you smack dab in the middle range between 40 and 120 hertz, meaning that you would have a tear-free gaming experience thanks to HDMI 4 VRR, which both consoles, again, are expected to have HDMI 2.1 compliance and HDMI 4 VRR, so you would be all set to go. It doesn't really matter if either console would have FreeSync or G-Sync at that point, because you would have VRR at 120 frames per second down to 40, you're good to go. The only time you might have a problem is if you have games that run lower than 40 hertz, say 30 hertz games, then at that point you would need low frame rate compensation to try to remove any tearing or juddering that you might experience. And I'm not sure if the next gen consoles are going to have that capability or not. But as you can see, 1080p, 1440p, 4K on the C10 all has a range of 40 to 120 hertz in all of those various resolutions over HDMI. So that is why the C10 is a great TV for gaming. And the C9 is as well. Presumably, the VRR range on the C9 is 40 to 120 as well. They simply don't say, that's all. Moving on to input lag, both TVs are essentially the same. The C9 is slightly faster at 13.5, 13.9, and 13.4, whereas the C10 is 13.7, 13.8, and 14.2, and then 14.3 on 4K 60 10-bit HDR. But that is a negligible difference. You will not notice a difference there. Both TVs have auto low latency mode. The input lag at 1080p 120 and 1440p 120 was mentioned at around 6 milliseconds, and that is the same for the C10. Though oddly enough, They measured the C10 at 4K 120 Hz at 11.5 milliseconds. That's still amazingly fast and great, although I would have expected it to be closer to 7 milliseconds. And then another strange thing is you look here, 4K with VRR is coming in at 23 milliseconds. That could be a firmware issue. The C10 is a new TV after all, so I expect after a few months when we get future updates for the C10 that this number, the 23.3 milliseconds with VRR at 4K, will improve. And both TVs essentially support the same resolution format, so you see a 9.6 out of 10 for the C9 and a 9.6 out of 10 for the C10. Both can do 1080p, 1440p, 4K at 30, 60, and 120 Hz. And both, for all intents and purposes, have the same input lag measurement, with the C9 coming in slightly, and I mean slightly, quicker overall. But again, in terms of real-world viewing, you will not notice a difference. And now, moving on down to input specifications, there are 4 HDMI 2.1 inputs for both the C9 and the C10, no difference there. They are all HDCP 2.2 compliant, and the C9 and the C10 use USB 2.0 inputs, not 3. And both the C9 and the C10 support Wi-Fi at 2.4 GHz and 5 GHz frequencies. No difference. Both TVs can support HDR10 and Dolby Vision. Neither TV can support HDR10+. Audio pass-through. Now this is a big one for the C9, okay? And perhaps I shouldn't say it's a big one, but this is a capability that's caused, for the C9, that's caused a little bit of controversy since the release of the C10. Because the C9 could do 5.1 DTS decoding with its internal speakers, and it could send it over eARC, and apparently the C10 does not have the DTS codec on it anymore. So let me say that again. The C9 could, with its internal speakers, decode DTS audio sources and run the audio through the speakers. Whereas on the C10, there is no DTS codec. There is no ability to decode DTS sources. So if you have a digital library of movies on your USB stick, and for whatever reason they are all DTS audio codec files, and then you plug that stick into your USB port on your LG C10, you will not get any audio. I just tried this experiment today, and lo and behold, I did not get any audio because the sources were DTS and there's no DTS codec on the C10. But before you freak out, it's not a huge deal really, because most people, if you have a digital library on an external hard drive or a USB stick, you can just plug it into your 4K player like I did my Sony X800. The X800 will decode the DTS for your TV, and the TV speakers will play audio. Piece of cake, no problem. Again, all you need is a 4K player. Same pretty much holds true for 4K Blu-rays. Pretty much all 4K Blu-rays, while they may be encoded in DTS, they'll also have other options like Dolby Digital Plus, which this TV can decode. If you want to use your TV as a PC monitor and you want to watch DTS movies on your PC using your LG CX, again, fear not. All you would have to do is download a software player that can decode the DTS for you, and then you would get audio through your speakers on your TV. One software program that I use to decode DTS is the VLC Media Player. Works great. So before you freak out and decide not to purchase this over DTS, it's not that big of a deal. Keep in mind that almost every streaming platform does not use DTS audio codecs. Amazon Prime, Netflix, those are not DTS. I've had no problems streaming any and all movies off of those platforms. YouTube, no problems with my CX. The audio always works. And also for those people, if you have a library of 4K Blu-rays, and for whatever reason, say hypothetically they were all just DTS, that's not a problem, because even if your Blu-ray player couldn't decode it, you could have, most Blu-ray players nowadays have a video out HDMI and an audio out HDMI. All you would have to do is send the HDMI video directly to your LG C10 and the HDMI audio out directly to your receiver, and the receiver would decode the DTS codec for you, and then it would play it through your speaker system. Or you could get a sound bar and it would do the same thing. So don't worry, it's not a big deal. I just want people to understand that in some instances, and for a very small select few people, not having a DTS codec on the C10 could present a problem. But it's not just LG. Samsung TVs have also dropped the DTS codec. So it's some sort of format war. I don't really know what's going on, why they're dropping it. I'm sure for LG it was some sort of cost-cutting measure. Who knows, maybe with a future firmware update they will implement it. But again, C9 has DTS support, C10 does not. However, there are plenty of workarounds for the C10 to get DTS audio to play on your C10. Alright, so moving on to the speaker quality on each TV. And again, if you're going to buy a high premium quality TV like an LG OLED, you're probably going to want to have a nice high-end soundbar or some sort of 5.1 or 7.1 configuration, so you're not going to worry too much about TV speakers. But not everybody has external speakers. A lot of people like to use their TV speakers, and I understand that. That is fine. So you see here on the C9, it scores a 7.4 out of 10 on frequency response and a 6 out of 10 on distortion. On the C10, a 7.6 out of 10 on frequency response and a 7 out of 10 on distortion. So the C10 speakers sound a fair bit better, according to Artings and their numbers, than the C9 speakers. So let's just, for example, take a look at weighted total harmonic distortion at 80 decibels right here. A good value is something that is below 0.10. So you see here that the C9 is 0.263, so it's well above that value. If you move over to the C10, you see that it's below that 0.1 threshold. It's 0.085. So you're having slightly less distortion and slightly better performance from the television speakers. And if you look at low frequency extension, you see that the LG C9 gets down to 67 Hertz and the C10 gets down slightly lower to 63 Hertz. So you may have a slightly better bass expression out of your C10. But again, these are TV speakers. Nobody's expecting a great deal from them, but you can chalk it up as a win for the C10. And then rounding everything out nicely, you see that the interface, both TVs get an 8.5 out of 10. Both use WebOS. There's been really no difference. If you look at time taken to select YouTube, 2 seconds, and 2 seconds on both TVs. On the C9, time taken to change backlight, 7 seconds. On the C10, 7 seconds. So there's no difference in performance. And then apps and features, both score an 8 out of 10. And then on the remote, both score a 9 out of 10. As you can see here, the C9 remote and then the C10 remote, there is absolutely no difference. They have the same layout, the same format, the same button structure, and both can be used as sort of that wand magic remote if you so choose. So that really pretty much does it. I mean, I think the moral of the story here is that the C9 might have scored better in a few categories, but we're talking about the slimmest of margins, and we're talking technically speaking here, just what the numbers say. Many of these differences are not really going to be noticeable in real-world viewing terms. So if we scroll all the way up and we look at an overall score for the C10 and the C9, just to compare really quick, we see that the C9 gets an 8.8 overall in mixed usage, right here. And the C10, also an 8.8 overall in mixed usage. So according to Artings and all the numbers we looked at, there isn't a whole lot of a difference between the two TVs. And to illustrate that point even further, I've made this chart breaking down where each TV has scored better than the other and where the similarities are. So if you look at the left side of the screen, you see the LG C9. You see that it did technically score a little bit better in SDR and HDR performance. Gray uniformity, viewing angle, color volume, gradient handling, less banding. Input lag was just slightly faster, but it really minimal difference. Has the audio codec DTS, which for some people that's a plus. And it has the full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 at 48 gigabits per second. That's not a big one because all you really need is 40 gigabits per second to do 4K, 120 hertz, 444 chroma subsampling at 10-bit, which the LG C10 can do. But I just wanted to put it in there. Some people get hung up on this. The C9 does have the full 48 gigabits of bandwidth, and it's worth noting. So moving over to the CX or the C10, it has better pre and post calibration accuracy. has slightly better pixel response time, but that is negligible. But again, I'm just talking about the technical numbers from Artings here. Has better motion handling, BFI at 120 Hertz, which the C9 can only do BFI at 60 Hertz. It has better speaker performance, and perhaps one that we didn't touch on yet is it has the AV1 video codec. The AV1 video codec is the emerging codec of choice for the near future on a lot of these streaming platforms. Basically, it allows for the streaming of ultra high definition content while also consuming less bandwidth than prior codecs that the LG C9 uses. Not a major difference, but worth noting. Sort of a future-proofing aspect, if you will. Because we are moving towards a digital-only world, a lot of physical media is simply being left behind. So having the most recent video codec might be important for some. But if you look at it overall, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 categories with the C9 scored technically slightly better, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories with the C10 technically scored slightly better. Now, if you look at the bottom right-hand section of your screen here on the lower right, you'll see that this is a section that tested scored the same for both the C9 and the C10. Contrast, local dimming, black uniformity, reflections, upscaling, 4K output, color gamut, image retention and burn-in. Both are flicker-free. Both handle Stutter and Judder in the same way. Both have HDMI 2.1 features for gaming that are critical, VRR, auto latency mode, 4K at 120 Hertz. Both have the same inputs. They have 4 HDMI 2.1s, they have an optical, and they have USB 2.0s. Both can do Wi-Fi at 2 and 5 gigahertz, and both have the same interface and apps, and both have the exact same remote. So, what does this tell you guys? What does all this mean? Basically, all this means is that, and I'm belaboring the point because I keep getting asked this in the comments string of my LG C10 review. What should I get? Should I get the C9 or should I get the C10? The C9 is $400 cheaper, $500 cheaper. Should I stick with that? Yes, stick with the C9. If you can get it for $400 or $500 cheaper, there's not a great enough difference between the two panels, the C9 and the C10, to justify paying a premium for the C10. But if it's only $100 or $200 difference, my advice would be to just get the C10. Because you would be getting, in that respect, the latest and greatest TV, and again, it's a negligible difference in price. It's only when you can get the C9 for $300, $400, $500 cheaper that you should really consider getting the C9 over the C10, okay? And with all of that broken down, I know it's a ton of information. If any of you have any more questions or want any more clarification on anything, please feel free to leave a comment down below. And also feel free to go to artings.com, an amazing site. I want to give those guys a shout out. Go check out the numbers for yourself. If you're thinking about making a purchase soon and you're not sure what to get, check out Artings. They have awesome benchmarks. They have awesome scores. They break everything down. They offer explanations. They have picture settings, all kinds of good stuff. Calibration. It's a great site to go to, so I definitely encourage you to check it out. If you like this video, please feel free to leave a like and smash that subscribe button. And until next time, folks, we'll see you later. Peace.